Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Building Science Digest. I'm your host, Christian Kennedy, and today we're going to talk about cool roof technology and why it's such a hot topic. Today, our guest is Ted Winslow. And Ted, you've been with CertainTeed for about 11 years, and your current role is product manager of low slope roofing, right?
That's right, yeah.
Beautiful. So you're the man for the job to talk about cool roof technology and all there is to know.
Absolutely. Excited to be here, Christian.
Yeah, great to have you. So with that being said, cool roof technology it's seemingly picked up a lot of momentum in recent months, possibly years. Can you explain why that is?
Absolutely, yeah. Cool roof technology, starting with just fundamentally the definition of what it is it's the ability of a roof system to ultimately be able to reflect the heat energy away from a home.
Okay.
So when we talk about heat energy, it comes in multiple forms. You have conduction, which is really the transfer of energy, through a building structure. So when we talk about R value, we're often talking about, the conductive heat that's transferring from one side of the building to the other.
Okay.
When we talk about convection, that's typically through airflow, leaks and gaps and cracks in the homes and things like that. That's where air sealing comes into play, and it's really important to seal up our home and buildings and structures. But then there's also radiation, which is the ability for heat energy that's radiating and permeating through the building itself. So that's where solar reflectivity and thermal emittance really come into play, where you're trying to deflect or reflect that heat energy away from the home or away from the building, and ultimately trying to have surface technologies that are able to not absorb as much energy, and they're able to emit more heat energy away from them themselves.
So it's a reflective part or a reflective technology that can now be utilized in residential and commercial structures, or on residential and commercial structures.
Yeah, and I think I should clarify as well that when we talk about often when we talk about reflecting and absorbing energy and things like that, we'll maybe simplify it in the sense that if I wear a black T-shirt and go outside, it's going to absorb a lot of heat energy. If I wear a white T-shirt, it's not going to absorb as much energy. But when we talk about buildings, it's a little bit different in the aspect that whites aren't just white. There's different levels and tiers of white ultimately, and highly reflective versions of white that are able to reflect more and more energy away from them, and then more just standard whites that when you put them next to these types of technologies, they almost look gray to some degree, which is quite surprising, honestly.
So does it come down to how white your roof is to be able to reflect the most amount of energy, or is it there's certainly got to be a deeper science
yes
behind
and no.
Okay.
I think when we look at it from a commercial building, for example, often we're talking about a low slope roof. Those low slope roofs are often on very high surfaces and things like that you're often not going to be able to see from the ground level, unless you have the ability to fly and you can kind of float up in the air, and you're able to look down and see the surface of the roof itself. Now, when we're talking about residential structures, we're often talking about steep slope roofing. Obviously, it's very visual. And you don't necessarily want a nice blue-sided home with CertainTeed siding that you're then going to incorporate a extremely reflective roof up on top of it that I'm sure your neighbors would certainly frown upon.
Right. Yeah. It's not aesthetically pleasing.
Exactly. But the unique thing is that we're able to embed a lot of these technologies into various color variations. So in our standard CertainTeed shingles, Solaris or Solaris as we like to call it, you'll often see various colors that have these unique cool roof or cool roof technology pigments in them that allow that energy to be reflected away from the surface themselves.
And it seems like it's such a generic concept. What is cool roof technology? What's the technology behind making your roof cool, right?
Exactly.
On any surface or any structure. And it particularly plays well in southern environments or southern hemispheres or just warmer temperatures, warmer climates,
well,
right?
Certainly those climates where you're going to be exposed to high percentages of heat energy, which are typically closer to the equator. Obviously, cool roofs begin to play more and more of an important role. We look at our standard roof systems up there in a commercial space. It could get upwards of 150, 190 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's crazy.
Which is extremely warm. Warm enough that you could be able to fry an egg up on the roof. Which
not that anyone might want to.
No,
but
there might be like a future super hip, restaurant, where they're like, hey, look, we can fry eggs on the roof.
Farm to table, table to roof, or farm
to low slope roof, type of restaurant. I trademarked that idea in case somebody decides to come out with it. But you mentioned warmer climates.
Yeah.
As we even look at markets like colder climates, cool roofs still play a benefit. We're seeing activity in markets like Denver and other more northern climates that are starting to gain more interest in cool roof technologies, because the net gain is still better with a cool roof than it is without it.
Okay.
Obviously, when it comes to our colder environments, there's other aspects that are at play. And in conduction, energy that's lost in the heating season is more impactful. So you're going to be utilizing insulation and air sealing, to really fight and defend, against energy loss within these spaces. It's not necessarily as impacted so much by the roof itself during the winter season. Additionally, you just don't have as much sunlight.
Right.
So that's the other aspect to it as well.
Yeah. But you're saying ultimately you don't need to have so much sunlight in order to have the cool roof technology perform. It could be limited amounts, but it still is acting in the same way or performing in the same way as it would. Okay.
Yeah, and especially in the summertime when you have these high radiative heat loads that are being subjected to the building, what you're really focusing on is reducing the air conditioning load. So the less energy that's
efficient almost in that sense, right? Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So we've talked about, even before we started recording, this acronym that's getting thrown around. There's a couple of them, but the one I want to focus on, SRI, I think, is that what it is? And can you explain that for the audience and make sure we're all on kind of the same page? Because I certainly wasn't before we started recording.
SRI is what we define as the Solar Reflectivity Index, or the Solar Reflectance Index. And it's basically a measure from 0 to 100. And really, it's intended just to be a measuring stick. It's a way that we can define what technologies are better than others. Okay. And then these thresholds are ultimately used to define various building codes. So we have Title 24 out in California, all of California. That's at a certain level, and then even more submarkets like LA County.
That's right.
That have even higher requirements that they're designed to meet. So as a manufacturer, we develop products like our GTA CoolStar Ultra, where we're trying to hit a certain level from a reflectance index standpoint.
Oh, interesting. So what is that level on the SRI dictated? I guess the codes dictate what level you need to be at on the index. Is that it? Okay.
And the reality is those codes evolve over time. And I think the unique aspect when we look at any building code across any particular aspect of the construction market is they all started kind of at one point where it was like, we're trying to define measures that can get people to build better buildings. Yeah. And then as we learn more from a building science standpoint, we're like, hey, we can actually save more energy, or it's more beneficial from an urban heat island effect to have this be the target as opposed to this be the target. So, one nature that you'll see as we go through these building code cycles is, these measures are continually evolving and changing. And, I look at a market like, California, as we mentioned, where, LA County, which represents like a third of all of California.
Wild to think about.
And it's, one of the just massive markets in all the United States. Yeah. That market itself tends to be a driver for all of California. So if LA County makes a big change, eventually you're start seeing those changes, which we already are, in other parts of California.
Right.
And then
that's the Title 31, not to interject, but right. So you already touched on Title 24, but that you're saying that is statewide.
Exactly.
And we were talking about it again before, but Title 31, as we've already alluded to, that is specific to LA County. Is that right?
Yes.
For now, I guess, maybe? Yeah. Okay. And so you're saying ultimately if LA County kind of does it, it's a trend setter, not necessarily catching on or catching up to the trend?
Yeah. And we've seen similar aspects with, whether it's green building codes in California that, now they're starting to permeate across the country, from what started in California. And it typically is those extreme markets. When you look at, markets like Florida, you look at markets like even, Massachusetts from an energy code standpoint, they tend to drive, in that New England market, a lot of the big, progressive changes that you'll see. Markets like Canada as well, where, they're subjected to a lot more, colder requirements in Canada.
Absolutely,
So, what Canada learns from a building science standpoint and a building code standpoint tends to then migrate into the United States.
Okay.
It might be years later. Yeah, it migrates south. Yeah, much like myself.
Yeah. There you go. And so it's interesting you say that, because the takeaway is it's beneficial regardless of where you are in the country. Seemingly, it's just that right now there are certain areas, specifically right now LA County, that are again being the trendsetter for making it a requirement for. Is it just commercial buildings at this point in time, or is it a overall structure standpoint?
At this point, it is mostly just really commercial buildings, but often you'll see that even in when we correlate commercial building codes to residential building codes, commercial tends to be again more of the trendsetter to residential building codes. The challenge with residential is there's not as much oversight when it comes to building officials and inspectors and things like that. They're due to the liability risk of commercial buildings, they're much bigger. The liability costs are much bigger. The insurance costs are much bigger. So then people tend to be more restrictive when it comes to a lot of the requirements in those spaces.
So it is really ultimately beneficial not only for a homeowner, right? It's not necessarily required at this point, but also business owners, building owners, whatever the case may be, not just to create or have a roof that is reflective of the sun, but ultimately it's energy efficient for the other systems that are at play within each of those structures.
Yeah, so it's going to reduce things like HVAC cooling loads and things like that. It's going to reduce the impact on the comfort of the occupants, and I think that's a big theme that we've seen when we talk about building science evolution in general. It started with the fundamental basics, the heat flow, airflow, moisture flow. And then as we've evolved, you have areas like fire propagation, and fire mitigation that are more prominent. We have things like acoustics that are much more prominent. We have sustainability and talking about resilience and how do we make these structures last much longer than we're inevitably seeing in today's market. And it's funny, you look at buildings from 100, 200 years ago, and many of them are still standing. And we've built homes in as recent as 5, 10 years, and in some cases they're failing due to just mismanagement of understanding the fundamental building science aspects.
And building science, as obviously this podcast talks about, it is very broad, but each individual pillar of it continues to kind of trickle down into, again, more like what we're talking about today, where there's specific technologies like Cool Roof that help the remaining pillars that are part of the building science catalog, if you will, as a whole. You touched on the urban heat island a little bit ago. So UHI, it's another acronym that gets tossed out quite frequently. Break that down for us, break that down for the audience, and what is a urban heat island?
Basically, heat is much higher in a urban setting than it ultimately is in a rural setting. Imagine a building, on a farmer's house on a farm, that fundamentally in the same, environmental landscape is going to be much cooler than, a building that's in the center of a dense cluster of commercial buildings. There's certain aspects to that, whether it's, the urban canyons and things like that, where basically what we mean by that is, it's literally a canyon between buildings. So you could have two, high-rise buildings. They have a gap between them, and the energy and the heat, that gets trapped within that space doesn't
between
move,
that gap between the two buildings.
Isn't able to escape as easily as it would be between the farmer's house and his neighbor's house 2 miles away.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so again, it's almost very simple when you think about it that way, especially the canyon portion of it, right? It is it's quite literally an urban canyon.
Yeah, and I think often, the way I like to look at a lot of different, building science concepts is, we're trying to compartmentalize them, and we look at them, at different scale. So for example, if I'm looking at an airflow test, for example. And this is a bit unrelated to cool roofs, but I think it's a good representative example. When we're testing a house wrap to understand, how does this perform from an air leakage standpoint? So we take this small segment and do this kind of small test basically between let's say it's a 4-inch sample by 4-inch sample, and then we try to blow air through it. I often use the example of if you put whatever it is up in front of your face, let's say it's a cell phone, and then put your hand on the other side of it, and then you try to blow air through it. Can you feel air on the other side? And in case of a cell phone, you can't feel air. So fundamentally a cell phone is an air barrier when it comes to the technical aspects of an air barrier test. But nobody's going to clad their entire building in cell phones and all with the same phone number, and you call it and it all lights up like crazy.
Yeah.
The challenge then to air seal that would be it's really the joints in between them. So the way we enhance that scale is we increase it to an 8-foot by 8-foot wall section. And then, we have 2 set examples where we cycle air pressure through them to see, okay, how much, is this representative wall assembly going to leak air through it? And then we're like, okay, well, now we need an example with windows and penetrations and tapes all these seams and stuff like that. So it's a more representative example. But then the true representative example is you actually build a building and you put a blower door in the front of it, and then you try to measure how much air is cycling in and out of that building
of the
itself.
structure,
Because there's so many different factors at play when it comes to how does this building perform as a quote unquote building envelope or an air barrier. So when we look at the case of, we talk about the urban heat island effect, and we're looking at it, of just a simple building structure itself, well, how is that impacting, the holistic nature of that entire city? So like LA County, for example, they have ordinances in place that are forcing people to make these changes. And you may only see a marginal impact from a standpoint of the total heat reduction that's being occurring within that area within LA in that environment. But that 2-degree Fahrenheit shift is now reducing a significant energy load once you scale it up to all of these buildings. And it's also reducing things like greenhouse gas emissions and other things within that environment as well.
And because we're talking about LA, the Title 31 is that just a cool roof building code? Is that what all that talks about, or is there more?
There's a lot of different factors in there.
Can we dive into those factors?
When we dive into talking about cool roofs, that's just a subsection that's within that. There's a lot of different other requirements, whether it's appliance requirements and HVAC equipment requirements and other things. It's a general green building standards code that encompasses so many different aspects, just like every building code. And we look at even the building codes across the United States. We have the mechanical building code. We have the the commercial building code, the residential building code, the international energy code, the green building code, and then every state and jurisdiction adopts them differently. And that's part of the challenge when it comes to building codes in the United States today, and even Canada and many other markets, is you institute a nationwide code, and every state adopts that code differently. Some instantaneously adopt it. Others might take a few years to adopt it. Then by the time they adopt it, they're already behind in terms of meeting the next building code. So then they implement things like stretch codes. Other states are considered home rule states. They basically make their own building code. And then each jurisdiction also adopts their own building codes.
Underneath each.
So like you could be in Phoenix, for example, and you could go from Mesa to Tempe and, just across, a city and have a totally different building code on the other side of the city. So,
interesting.
Which makes it challenging from,
absolutely,
when we talk about, our contractors and builders and distributors, that they're having to navigate all these different things. And, fortunately, there's a lot of different resources, including manufacturers like CertainTeed, where, we're able to provide building science guidance and
the goal is to make it easy.
They can reference things like the Cool Roof Rating Council, which is coolroofs.org, which is a very good website in terms of being able to tap into just a general understanding. But when we talk about cool roofs, what are we really talking about? What do I need to know, and how can I implement? And
how does it differ?
Exactly.
Possibly between jurisdictions or even states.
And the nice thing about that site as well is that you can cross-compare different products and systems as well. So
perfect.
If I want to understand that I got to meet, the Title 31 requirement in LA County residential or LA County commercial, these products meet that requirement and that standard, and the architects and specifiers can reference those.
Right. With that being said, because cool roof technology is, we focus on the roof, are there other ways to take advantage of that technology, or is it simply isolated to the roof and that standpoint on the structures?
I would say in general, it's isolated to the roofs and upper surfaces themselves. There's certainly aspects that I could see getting incorporated into siding or cladding technologies and things like that as well. But that's really the most directly flat exposed surface. And the challenge with that as well is that you're trying to balance things such as resilience and durability in those areas as well. So as you imagine, if you have a low slope or a flat roof, there could potential, water ponding and things like that. Even, we touched on earlier, like colder environments.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up Denver in that instance.
Like Denver,
right?
You could have a roof that's just totally covered in snow. Right. So, in terms of whether you have a cool roof or not, when it's covered in snow, the snow is fundamentally kind of acting as your cool roof in that, sense.
Right. It is, which I think most people wouldn't think of as well, right?
Exactly.
The snow's on the ground or on the roof. It is actually reflecting the heat.
For sure.
Yep. Really interesting. So we've covered cool roofs, the urban heat island, SRI, a lot of these different things. What sort of trends are you seeing now? I know LA County in Title 31, that's kind of a trend setter. Are there other areas that are maybe following that trend that you see? I know we touched on Denver already. We even brought up San Francisco beforehand and how we're like, 'cause California seems to be at the forefront of these kind of building codes.
Sure.
Are there any others that you come to mind, or even speak to San Francisco?
You're definitely seeing a lot in obviously the California market and LA, like you said, tends to be a trendsetter and kind of, permeating those more advanced systems and technologies into other parts of the state. But obviously, markets like Denver, we're seeing activity, even in areas like Florida where, you have these extreme temperatures, even, to some degree, even, parts of Texas and things like that, where you're having bubbling interest kind of creep up in terms of how can we mitigate and manage, some of these loads from a heat energy standpoint that's impacting our buildings.
Absolutely.
And they're all kind of phased, differently. Like I mentioned with building codes, they kind of adopt them all in their own kind of cadence and sequence of things. And some markets are more advanced or progressive than others, like your California, Massachusetts, Florida, and other markets as well.
What sort of objections are you getting or obstructions are you getting when trying to implement the technology? What's kind of prohibiting maybe a building owner from diving in, or maybe even states, jurisdictions from adopting this sort of technology?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, we often see with building codes that, it's funny because, when I've always kind of looked at the building code as, it's kind of like passing a test, and, when, you're trying
the test is changing.
Yeah, when you're just trying to meet the building code itself, you're trying to pass that test. But you look at it, from a grade school standpoint, passing the test is like getting a D.
Right.
So it's like
mine were C's. I was able. You had to get a C to pass. Yeah,
so, which I know my parents, would never have approved.
I got A's, strictly A's.
My parents would have never approved of me getting, straight D's, which, may or may not have happened at some point in my life.
Yeah, but you got straight A's in the stuff that matters, and that's why you're here now.
Yeah, and right? I think even, in my own upbringing as well, that, I remember I had this, progressive transition from 4th to 5th grade. My mom seems to think it's because I had a really good teacher in 5th grade. But what they don't remember is they started incentivizing me with money.
There you go.
Back then as well. So it was like I went from like D's and C's to like straight A's and A pluses at that point, kind of moving forward.
So you're saying that's what we need to do to incentivize other states and jurisdictions?
To some degree, and I
in a half-jokingly way. There is
in a half-jokingly
some
way,
sort of
for sure.
push-pull there.
There is some push-pull there. So, the building code gets you to a certain threshold, but in order to get to those more advanced systems and make them more commonplace across the industry, whether we're talking about, things like SIPS panels and structurally insulated concrete forms and things like that, and these more advanced systems in the residential space, in order to get people to truly adopt them, you have to build in incentives that they want to go for.
Right.
Energy Star has done some work in terms of, being able to drive people to make that next step. They're getting rebates and incentives towards doing that. We also have, various government incentive programs that have been implemented as well. But so
it's happening.
It certainly is happening.
It's there, yeah.
But the building code still has to catch up,
right?
To some degree as well.
And with that being said, the SRI that we talked about in the beginning, Solar Reflective Index,
yes,
right? Okay, good, got it. There you go. That's an A. That is a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the most reflective.
Correct.
So the cool roof technology that we're talking about and that CertainTeed provides, where do we fall on that scale, right? From a commercial standpoint, from a residential standpoint? I mean, really strictly commercial for this conversation, but on that scale, where are we falling? And then what's the title or what's the code required?
Yeah, really, our goal is to drive to the highest standard, when it comes to all the products that we offer. Our earlier iteration of product was our CoolStar technology. We've taken that up a notch to the ultra level.
The ultra CoolStar technology.
With CoolStar Ultra, that takes that to that next level, that Title 31, where, we're not just striving to meet Title 24, which covers all of California to the highest standard. We want to meet Title 31, and even within Title 31, there's different layers of standards in that as well, where you have LA County residential, and then even up a notch further from that, which is LA County commercial.
Gotcha. Okay, and so the CoolStar
and you're
Ultra,
looking to get 80 and above.
Got it.
In those cases.
Thank you. Okay, that helps paint a clearer picture. So 80 and above, and that's very reflective at that point.
Yes.
And CoolStar Ultra, what we have is 80 and above, is what
correct
we're saying here. Got it. Yeah. Okay, beautiful. So what other factors play a role into not only adopting but taking advantage of the technology in and of itself? Is it we've touched on energy efficiency for one, right? And we talked about the heat canyon, the urban canyons, excuse me. What other factors are at play, or what other things can people take advantage of to?
Yeah, I mentioned before, durability and resilience. And we talk about the ability of a building to, and not just the building itself, the individual components and the materials. So when we talk about the technologies that we leverage, we utilize multiply, systems, on the low slope roofing side, modified bitumen technologies that are much more durable than most systems. They also have a thermal mass to them as well, so that also helps reduce the amount of energy that's being driven into the home and the building itself. But they're also very durable, especially when it comes to moisture durability, the ability to mitigate and prevent moisture from driving into the building. Also as you're reducing that heat energy, on that surface itself, you're also limiting the effect of your joints and systems and things like that to degrade and fail from a performance standpoint.
Interesting.
Often when we talk about building products, it's not the products themselves that fail. It's the joints and intersections where they all come together. You have often, dissimilar materials that are coming together, whether it's bricks, and the mortars between the brick, that's basically linking these two bricks together. If that mortar fails, now you have a gap and a crack, between your brick system. Same on the roof, as things kind of expand and contract as, heat temperatures fluctuate, which the reality is, if you look at all of our buildings, everything is always moving.
Right.
This room that we're in right now, it may seem, static in a sense, but the reality is that, as temperatures shift and change and things like that, everything is constantly in flux. Moisture's driving through the building and things like that, being absorbed by the surfaces and things like that as well. And we have to factor all that into when we look at our building as a whole, how it's being effective and how resilient is it. And that's really, I think, the theme that we're starting to see when we talk about sustainability is it's the ability for these buildings to be durable, to be resilient, to last the test of time.
So Ted, with all that being said, what's next for the cool roof technology, the future? What do you kind of foresee changing and happening?
Part of the challenge when we talk about building science and building code evolution is, we're kind of, as an industry, getting to a point where our walls can only get so big. Our roofs can only get so big. And when I say so big, I mean really the spaces between the occupied space and the outside space. It starts getting more and more expensive, the more, the bigger plenums that we have, the bigger wall cavities that we have. So you almost hit this peak threshold in terms of how much insulation can I fit into this thing. The challenge when we talk about, our commercial roof systems and low slope systems is we can't incorporate things like ventilative air as easily as we can, say, in a steep slope residential structure to help, extract some of that heat energy out of the building itself. So now we have to kind of shift into looking at new aspects and ways to do that. Green roof technologies is one area that, we can kind of explore in terms of, building these vegetative roofs that, help, also provide more green space, into our buildings and into our urban environments. We're also seeing, the aspects like solar photovoltaics, that can be incorporated on these, essentially free space that you have on top of a building that, nobody's, often going out and just hanging out on the roof of the building doing work. They're obviously working inside the building itself. But then we're also seeing aspects where now we're starting to incorporate more service-based type technologies like sensoring and things like that, so that we can better have predictive, understanding of, is this, roof going to leak? Is it, leading to a condition where, we're starting to see failure at certain parts and points of the roof. And,
predictive almost.
Almost predictive to a great degree. And also to a point where you can have monitoring systems that help you kind of understand what's going on with my building. Is it, why is this wall surface much, at a higher temperature than this wall surface, and am I losing energy? Is there a gap or crack and other things? So I think that's where we'll start seeing a lot of growth in understanding, is incorporating these smart technologies into our buildings, giving building owners and occupants more freedom of understanding, how can I manage my comfort within this space?
Feedback.
Feedback, exactly. And, I think comfort, even when it comes to, how we even created, this building itself, in our headquarters, we're exploring and trying to understand, where are these trends going? What makes an occupant more comfortable in, one space versus another, incorporating things like the ability to see the outside versus not the outside. I'm of an engineering background, so it's like if you have a hardcore engineer versus a hardcore architect, the engineers prefer, no windows, whereas,
closed off.
An architect might prefer more open windows so you can see,
Yep.
and a lot of that, I say that in jest, but, the point behind that is that, it's much easier to manage a wall with no windows from an energy efficiency, heat transfer standpoint,
we've talked about that
than
on
it
the
is,
show.
with a window. Same on the roof itself. When you talk about how can we manage this space in a new way, green roofs are, like I said, one aspect to that. Solar photovoltaics are going to only continue to grow as well. Ways that we can incorporate ways to, give back the energy that's already being subjected to our building.
Or deflect it.
Yeah.
Ted Winslow, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been an excellent conversation. We hope to have you back very soon.
Yeah.
Thank you all for watching. This has been Building Science Digest. We've just talked about cool roof technology and why it is such a hot topic. You can continue cool topic. Thank you. You can watch, listen, and view this podcast anywhere that you guys can get your podcast. Thank you for watching.